Welcome to my week at the club. I'm Roger Capello, bringing you the action from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. This week I had another good game against Jim Donahue. But before I get into that, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you about an astronomy topic. Actually, to revisit a topic from last week. I was talking about one-way mirrors and saying how they were impossible. And during that conversation, I pointed out the phenomenon of optical masking and how that is related to seeing stars during the daytime if you were able to, it's related to our inability to see stars during the daytime. And I pointed out sort of gratuitously, I guess, that you could see stars during the daytime if you look with binoculars or a telescope, and gave a hand-waving explanation for why that should be true. And it's, I decided to do a little better job of, hopefully of explaining that. If you think about it, when you look through binoculars at night, the stars all get brighter. They look a lot brighter, at least to me they do. But if you go out to a football game and use binoculars to look at the pass plane or something, they look about the same brightness. It's not like they're glowing really brightly at you. And so why does the same pair of binoculars work one way at night and a different way during the day? Well, that's a good question. And to explain it, I really need to go into a little more detail about how you get images through a telescope or binoculars. And if you have a pair of binoculars, like my Nikons here, these are 10 by 50, 10x50. You might have 7x35 on yours. And what those numbers mean are, well, the first number is the 10, or the 7, and if it's 7 by 35, is the magnification. And that is how many times bigger the image actually appears. It's stretched by 7 times horizontally and by the same amount vertically. Otherwise, people would look kind of funny through them. And then 10 by 50s is 10 times larger, 10 times wider. Okay, so it's stretching out the image that you're looking at. The second number is the objective size, the lens size, and that's in millimeters. And 7 by 35 says that the lens on it is 35 millimeters. 10 by 50, the lens is 50 millimeters. So those are a little better they gather more light, so they're better for looking at stars at night if you're out shopping for binoculars. And the manufacturers of binoculars have arranged things to balance sort of two competing effects. The bigger lens is capturing more light, but the higher magnification also is spreading that light over a larger angle, more square degrees that you're getting light from. So the amount of light per square degree is less as you increase the magnification. And if you think about it, our eyes, the pupil in our eyes, when it's sort of darkish, is about 5 millimeters in diameter. So a 50 millimeter lens is 10 times larger than our eye is. And that means that the area is 10 squared, or 100 times more light that's being captured by the binoculars. But that 100 times more light is then spread over 100 times as much angular area. So the brightness doesn't change at all when you use those binoculars. And that's one reason those two numbers are chosen the way that they are. But this doesn't happen with stars. And why is that? Why do stars get brighter? Well, to understand that, you have to know a little bit about size scales. Stars are really tiny little things. They're the nearest ones and largest ones are a few milliarc seconds, and then they get less than a milliarc second as they go down to be more distant. Now, a milliarc second is about the size of a, 200 centimeters, 2 centimeters, about the size of a golf ball on the moon. Pretty small. And so that, can that be right? No, that's not right. 2 meters. No, it's the size of my mistake. About the size of a weather balloon, about the size of a person on the moon. I was thinking about microarc seconds. So, that's still quite small. The person standing on the moon is seen from the Earth is quite small. And that's about the natural size of the disk of the star. Now, as the light from the star comes down through the atmosphere, it follows a wiggly path because it gets the atmosphere is irregular. It's warm parts, cooler parts. It has wind currents that are flowing through it and so on. So there's a lot of density variations, and that refracts the light and makes it follow kind of a random path as it comes through the air. And that random path is changing quite rapidly. And that's what causes stars to twinkle, is that path wiggles the starlight around. You see it moving back and forth, and that causes it not to stay in the same place, so it looks like it's twinkling. And that twinkling means that the disk for the star actually gets spread out over about an arc second instead of milli-arc seconds. So it's 100 to 1,000 times larger after we see it through our atmosphere. It's blurted out 100 to 1,000 times larger and horizontally and vertically. So it's a much greater area of angle that the star has been spread out over. Then the star, then it gets worse because we see it with our eyes, and our eyes don't see an arc second. The resolution of our eyes is about a minute of arc, which is about the size of apparent size of Tycho crater on the moon. Tycho crater's like 50 miles across. But on the moon, when we look up at it at night, it's about a 30th of the diameter of the moon, which is an arc minute. The moon is 30 arc minutes, so a 30th of it is 1 arc minute, which is about the size of Tycho. So it's much larger, even though it's small. It's much larger than that person size, natural size of the moon, or actually the star, or when the star is blurred out by seeing it, actually gets to be a couple of kilometers across, but much less than the 80 kilometers of Tycho. So this star image is much smaller than the pixel in our eye, basically, so that all the starlight falls into 1 pixel, even if it moves around some. And if you expand the star by 10 times, it still is smaller than the pixel in our eye, so all the light still falls into 1 pixel, and it looks the same brightness. And we don't really have pixels. Well, actually we do. If you look at the cones, they're sort of pixelated, our receptors on the back of our retina, but that's actually, they're closer together than the fundamental resolution of our eye. So that's not the limiting factor. It's actually the optics of the eye that makes our resolution be about an arc minute. And so all the light of the star stays within 1 pixel, even if you look through a telescope. And so it gets brighter and brighter, but it doesn't get spread out at all. And whereas the blue sky that you look up at does get spread out in horizontally and vertically, so it gets stretched out, gets like I said, it's about a counteracting effect between it's a wash between how much light you collect with your binoculars and how much it gets stretched out. But that's not true for the stars. The stars just keep getting brighter. And so looking through the binoculars, you can actually see the stars shining in that blue sky if you know where to look for the bright stars. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, though, that astronomers, optical astronomers, are much more interested in dim objects. There are only a handful of really bright objects, bright stars in the sky. Most of them are very dim, nebulae are dim, all kinds of things are dim that the optical astronomers want to look at. And for that, you really do need dark skies, even if you're using a telescope. So remember to turn out those porch lights when you go to bed at night. Okay, well, on to the chess. So this week was the start of a new tournament, the George Sturgis Memorial. And oddly enough, in the first round, I played Jim Donahue, who I've played in the first round now 3 months in a row. We seem to be on a cycle where, I'm just a little bit below the top of the pairing list, and he's a little bit below the center. And so in the Swiss system, we get paired up against each other in the first round. And I've had black all 3 games. The first 2 games I played sort of an Indian system. I think a Benko Gamut and then some other Indian approach. And so I tried something a bit different in this game. And what I did after d4 on his part was to go into a Slav defense. Okay, and I'm going to try to keep my comments sort of brief. So we got to this position after 6 moves. And right here, I played h6, and I think that's a kind of a minor mistake. It's a kind of a finesse error. So my thinking is that, well, at some point he's going to play his knight out to h4 and trade off my bishop. Well, I don't mind that too much if I, for example, had my bishop on g6 and he did that and I made some other move, I don't know what. Let's say I just developed my knight. If he took, I would take back with my h-pawn, and that's not too, the pawn structure is not weakened too much on the king side. I could castle over there, or I have possibilities of using the rook on the semi-open h-file. So, this sort of exchange isn't too bad. But the way I did it, after he played e3, was to make a space for my bishop so that I can save it entirely if he attacked it with the knight. Thinking now if the knight goes out to h4, I'll just be able to retreat my bishop back all the way to h7. But the problem is the way he, I overlooked his next couple moves. He exchanged off the the c and e pawns, and then played bishop to d3. He didn't play bishop to d3 immediately because if he did that in this position, I could then take on c4 and he'd have to spend a move recapturing. So instead he traded off the pawns first and then played bishop to d3. And now where am I going to put my bishop? I could put it on g4, I guess. It wouldn't be horrible, but my idea of retreating it back to h7 is really not that great because he could exchange and my knight could undevelop itself to h7. And I can't go to g6 anymore because if I went to g6 and he exchanged, I'd have to take back with my f-pawn, and that would be very weak. So I sort of shot myself in the foot a little bit with h6. Anyhow, play developed. I had nothing better really than to exchange those bishops, and I did the same thing on my side. We both castled. Now with this Carlsbad pawn formation, I have these pawns, this pawn structure here, which is quite strong, and he has this pawn structure. And we both have a half-open file. He's got the C file, I have the E file. And one of the strategic ideas open to white here, of course, I've talked about it in other games that I've played, is the minority attack. And that's what he goes in for. He attacks with these two pawns, A and B pawns, against my majority of pawns that I have over here on the queen side. And I knew that was coming. I just had to keep an eye on it. And at this point, I had to take a little time out for a prophylactic move because I foresaw that his next move was going to be a4, and I would need to be able to. I guess I could have changed my move order. I could have played rook e8 first. Anyhow, in answer to a4, at some point, either on that previous move or this move, I have to play a6, so that when he pushes his pawn, I can exchange it off. Okay, so we reached this position, and right here, he should just really play fairly simply and just play the rook over, defending that pinned knight. And so that protects it twice. It's only attacked once. Now he could, if I don't attack it again, he could unpin his queen and wouldn't even have to move it to a square where he continues to defend the knight because the rook is defending it. He probably wants this rook on the C file anyhow because of this pressure on that potentially backwards C pawn. This gives him a pretty good position. But what he did instead of that was to try to fight me for the A file. And the thing is, that's a fight that he can't win. So I can just double on the A file, and and now I'm threatening to win the rook, of course. And after exchanges, and I take back, now I own the A file. So this whole sequence of moves doesn't work out that well for white. It would have been better just to go ahead and develop the rook, the other rook. So he wanted to get out of the pin immediately before I could attack it a second time. After all, in this position, knight e4 is threatened, and he has to do something about that. So he unpinned immediately, and I kept the pressure on with a second attack. And now at this point, he really he plays rook to c1, defending this knight a second time, and that's really not his best move. What he should do here is trade off his weak b pawn. He's actually going to lose it. It was his last chance to save that pawn. Earlier he couldn't do that because, say in this position back here after move 16, if he had instead of playing rook to a1, if he had tried to trade off the pawn now, thinking that I would have to take back. The thing is, I could take back with the queen, and that just gives me a second attack. It helps this attack against the pinned knight. But in the game, in the game line, after I play the queen to b4, now this queen is no longer defending c6, and he has a chance actually to trade that pawn off, and I'd have to take it. If I took, and if I took back, well, I wouldn't. So actually, I would not take back. I would take the knight with the rook, right? This is kind of a odd line. It's I'll just show it to you because it's a little curious. But if we went down this line, he could take my knight, even though his queen's under attack, and assuming I took his queen, he gets another one immediately with check, and I block with the queen. And in this position, pawns are equal. White's queen is more active, but black's rook is more active, so it's about some sort of dynamic equality here. Instead of that, he went down this line, rook to c1. And what that does is, as I said before, is loses the pawn on b5, as I go ahead and take it. And even though I have kind of ugly looking pawns, even if I lose one of these b pawns, I'll still have a passed b pawn, which might prove important in the game. So he makes a bit of a small mistake here. The best move at this point is just to go ahead and to stay, is to keep some initiative, to counterattack with the knight. If I trade the knights off, then after knight takes, pawn takes, this knight on f6 would have to move, and then this pawn on d5 could fall. So this gives him some sort of dynamic equality again. But instead, with playing knight back, that sort of falls into a really defensive posture. Maybe he just didn't see White's response here, which is to go ahead and now pin that knight. It's not a terribly strong pin, but it's it has a threat. If this queen is going to come up and try to start hassling my king and win pawns up here, this knight is attacked twice, and I could win it. And it's not going to move easily unless that rook is defended. So he took time out to come back and defend the knight. Okay. In this position, okay, I looked at it for a while, and as I said before, he is threatening to infiltrate with his queen. All right, so queen down with check, and maybe win my b pawn. And there's not a whole lot I can do about that. I would love to block with my queen on c4, but his knight is guarding this square. So I can't do that. Instead, after I looked for a while, I found this active plan, and it was I had to look 4 or 5 moves ahead, I guess, to see what could come out of this, because otherwise, things could go badly wrong if I let his queen into my position. And that's in fact what he did. He came down. Now he has a double attack on my knight and my pawn. So my play is rather forced too. In fact, this whole line is fairly forced. But this, my knight has gone from being a passive piece back here in a defensive posture to actually becoming quite active now on c4 and threatening to add another attacker on this pin knight on b1. So that sort of maneuver. So he can't he can't really take the pawn. If he took the pawn, that would lose a piece immediately. Okay, to knight takes. So instead, what he did, and what I expected him to do after knight up, is to check with the queen. And there's a little bit of a threat here, which is that if I do the sort of obvious move, king to h7, then it's just a perpetual check. He comes and checks me from f5. And either I go back to the back rank and he comes down and checks me again, or I could play pawn up, and now this knight on f6 is hanging, and there will be, even a stronger perpetual check threat. So that didn't appeal to me, but what I had planned back when I was looking several moves ago at this knight maneuver was the move that I made, which is to drop back with the queen and block. And now he really has no choice but to trade queens off. It's pretty much forced. If he takes the pawn, he loses a piece. I just play knight takes knight, and his knight is pinned. He can't take back. Okay, and my evaluation of this position in my mind when I was going into this line was that it's very good for black, and it is, because he has a variety of problems. He has back rank weaknesses. He has his pin he has to worry about. I have a passed pawn, even though they're a little bit weakened. He can't simply play knight takes knight, because I could correct my pass on my double pawn structure and have a protected pass pawn. So there are all sorts of problems for white. What he did was to attack my rook on h1. So that's right here. I dropped it back to what I felt was the most flexible square. And then he has time to attack my pawn on b7, but he can't win it. I can attack his knight. And he dropped back. This was all part of his planned maneuver, and I'm sure what his thinking was that he was restraining the b pawn, keeping it going from c4, and possibly would post the knight on this square where it could keep an eye on my isolated d pawn. So, interesting looking maneuver. But at this point, I had, coming up to this, I had sort of considered going back and repinning his knight on a1, something like that with my rook, which I think was, was not a bad plan. But then I realized that if I did that, he could just play the knight out, and his last move with the knight actually defended his rook also. And so it unpinned his knight. And now after rook takes rook, knight takes, in my mind, looking at this position, I decided that having a one pawn advantage when it's isolated double pawns like that, with two knights on the board for each of us, those pawns could just be too weak. He could maneuver his knights to blockade and then capture one or both of my pawns. And this didn't appeal to me that much. So I looked for a while and found a considerably stronger move, which was to play my knight into e4. And now that stops his plan of developing his knight. He can't play it to d2 or to a3. They're both guarded. And if he comes to c3, which is what he did, that's a problem for him, because I can simply take it and he takes back, and now well, if you saw my move, then I'm sorry, but if you didn't see it, this is a little quiz for you. What's the best move for black here? If you want to pause your video, I'll give you a couple seconds to restart it. Okay, the real killer here is b4, and it's much stronger than it looks. That pawn runs like Forrest Gump. So the rook has to go somewhere. It can't. Well, I mean, all the various squares are not good. If it went to b3, that would actually cause a checkmate on the back rank. There's no way other than throwing away a knight or the rook to stop this back rank mate. So he can't go there. If he goes to b2, my pawn will just attack him again, and he can't go in front of it because of my knight. So he did the only move that he really can do is go back to c1, but I just keep pushing that pawn. And now what's he going to do? It turns out there's no way to stop this pawn. He could put the knight in front of it, but that just gives the knight away. Okay, and he has problems with a pin on the back rank. He moved his king over to try to unpin himself, but that's one move too slow because I just pushed the pawn again. And it looks like, oh, maybe he could play rook here, although now that's actually even that would be a fork. If he played, rook to b1, I could just fork with the knight and win the rook that way. But even, a move ago, if he had, instead of playing the king there, if he had stopped the back rank mate by giving himself some Luft, the same move would have been true. I could have attacked him, and if his rook comes over, seemingly attacking this guy twice, it's no good because I could just play rook down, and that rook is pinned. I'm going to win it. If he trades him off, I'm going to get a queen. So instead, like I said, he played king to f1. I pushed the pawn, and he realized he couldn't stop it. He took it with his knight. I took the knight back, and after he attacked my knight, I just came back to a great outpost where it defends my pawn. So there's really not, this was, there's also a fork threat, although of course he can meet that, but it's, this is a hopeless position for white. So hope you enjoyed it. I guess I kept my analysis a little shorter today, but let me know in the comments or like it if you liked it, and I'll try to be responsive to your feedback. So long.